top of the screen.
Okay, so we need to screen share it.
Yeah.
You're all set.
Right, I just need to do got it, thank you. Okay. Good morning, today is Wednesday, February 1st. Rapid, and it's 8:30 a.m. The Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're resuming our work on S5, the Affordable Heat Act, and we're joined this morning by the PUC, which has been reviewing our bill as introduced and come back with comments and suggestions about editing that document. And just so people know, we have, I think overall, the approach of the committee has been that we have a program we want to implement. The PUC has the lion's share of the work to implement that program. And so while we have a sort of a core design goals for the program, because they're the ones implementing, we're asking and inviting them to tell us what changes will help them be more successful in managing and implementing their program. So with that, turn it over to you folks. If you could just introduce yourself for the record, and the floor is yours.
I'm Kyle Landis Marinello, General Counsel at the Public Utility Commission.
And my name is Tom Maurer. I'm the Policy Director at the PUC.
Great. So thanks very much. Look forward to seeing your markup.
Sure. So we have submitted a red line with some suggested edits and comments, and I'll just go through that this morning and jump in with any questions as we go along. So first of all, we know in our comments that PUC is not taking a position in support of or opposed to the bill. Rather, we're focused on, as Chair Bray said, how do we improve the implementation of this bill should the legislature choose to enact it. So I'm not going to cover all of our red lines this morning unless there are questions. Some are just small changes we've made, for instance, editing the statutory references so it's clear that because this program isn't starting until January 1st, 2026, we're going after the 2030 and the 2050 standards for emissions reductions, but not the 2025 standard. The first addition we have in here is just another finding that recognizes the federal money that's available for a lot of this work. We think it's important to incorporate references to that federal money in this bill so that it's clear that obligated parties can access that money to do these clean heat measures at the least cost possible. And here is a reference, for instance, to the statutory provisions on emissions reductions. Instead of referencing all of Section 578A, we specify it's A2 and A3, which is the 2030 and 2050 emissions reductions requirements. So here we thought there should be a little more clarification on what can be done by rule, what can be done by order, and we would look for the legislature to give us the most flexibility possible in doing this. So this language here makes clear that the fact we're doing the rulemaking doesn't prevent us from doing orders along the way, both before and after the rulemaking occurs. And we also suggest giving us permission to make changes even to the rule once it's passed without going through the normal lengthy Administrative Procedure Act requirements for rulemaking, but instead having a more streamlined approach where we would put out a draft change to our rule, receive comments, respond to any comments that are received, and we would then be able to issue an order that would adjust a provision in the rules. If someone were unhappy with that adjustment, they would still have an ability to appeal to the Vermont Supreme Court, we would let the committees of jurisdiction know immediately if we were making this type of change. And obviously, anything that we do, the legislature can always step in and change it if there's concern over it.
Is that typical to allow appeals to be to the Supreme Court?
Yes, that's the standard appeal language. This reference to 30 VSA section 12 is any order that the Public Utility Commission makes, an aggrieved party can appeal directly to the Supreme Court.
Great, thank you.
If I understand correctly, usually that's after everyone's gone through the requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act, for which you're looking for an exemption.
Yes, and actually I should be clear, if you go through the rulemaking process and someone's unhappy with a rule that you end up with, a challenge to that actually goes to Superior Court and then could be appealed from there to the Supreme Court. But the orders that we issue in our cases that come in front of us get appealed directly to the Vermont Supreme Court. So this is kind of a hybrid approach we're suggesting here, but we think it's necessary to be able to implement this. And so if we can give you some background on the renewable energy standard, when that program was given to us, we were given much more flexibility in how to do it than what S5 currently gives us, because it was just a general direction to do the program by rule or order. So the way that played out is the commission issued a series of orders to implement the renewable energy standard, and then figured out some of the problems that always arise when you're getting a new program off the ground, and then had a lot of that ironed out by the time the rulemaking process happened. Here, we have to do the reverse. We're doing the rulemaking right off the bat. When this thing passes, we're going to start on that process. It's on a very tight timeline to get those rules ready for submission to the legislature and then finalized as the rules that will implement this program. And then we anticipate we may need to make some course corrections in the first few months and first few years after that. Those rules go into effect as things come up. And so just an example, we might define low income in a particular way in the rules, and then we start the program and we hear from a Vermonter who was clearly everyone intended to fold into the definition of low income, but the way we wrote the language, it doesn't capture them. If we have to go through a formal rulemaking process, it might be a year or more before that customer could actually start getting the benefits for low income customers. Whereas this is a more streamlined process that would allow us to do that by order.
One quick question. So on orders, there's a notice and comment period. Is that in addition to the normal order process?
Yes.
So in other words, you could ordinarily, an order, you would just proceed, but in this case, you're giving notice and then you're on.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We've added that stuff.
I mean, it's very rare for the PUC to issue an order without reaching out to people who would be affected by that order. So, this is very much in that spirit.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I want to be clear, we don't anticipate using that provision. We just want to have it available if needed.
Senator White?
Thank you, Chairman Bray. One of the comments we received on this bill was the GREET model and how we would adapt it to Vermont. Do you see this change helping to adapt the GREET model in any way to Vermont? Does that play in?
To Tom on this.
Right. So we have not used the GREET model before. The statute lays out that we're to use that. And so I don't think the ability to issue an order modifying a rule really changes what the statute directs us to do.
Okay, I understand.
Yes, it should be clear. Any order that we would do that might change the rule, the order would have to be in compliance with the statute as well.
Sort of asking you to argue against your own position. But so let's say in the interest of full disclosure, what levels of protection do we lose by not by stepping outside the APA?
I think there is a loss of all the formal requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act. And so that requires a certain amount of written comments, responding to comments. Again, we do fold that part into it, but there are additional requirements such as a public hearing, the requirement to go through LPAR, the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. And so this is a more streamlined process. And I think that as a practical matter, as I said, we don't anticipate using this, and we would be very careful about using it. We would want to hear from parties if there were any concern with the change we were making. And I think stakeholders who have been through our very robust public engagement process leading up to any change we make to a rule, I think they would tell you that we do hear from everyone who shows up at a hearing or files comments, and we take all those comments seriously, and we would do the same here.
Senator McCormick, so I think, one of the reasons that this process, so here's the timeline that's posted on our, for people who know, this is the S5 timeline is introduced. It has an awful lot in conversation with parties, trying to think of a way, there's an awful lot to do, and it's a community schedule, sort of looking at ways of making it more achievable. In part, that's one of the, let's see us have increased the likelihood of success by building in flexibility where merit. Senator White.
Thank you, Chairman Gray. So within the rulemaking process, we have the economic analysis and the environmental analysis. We don't lose that with this suggested change.
So all of that would be done in the initial rulemaking. If we were making a change to the rule by order after the rules have been finalized, I do think what we would look at in that order is if there are any changes to the environmental and economic analyses that were provided in the original rulemaking. So it would not be the formal rulemaking papers that include those analyses, but we would address if we thought a change would impact those.
Okay, that makes me feel comfortable.
My vision is these are more administrative type changes that we did not foresee the first time through the rulemaking process. It's less likely that it's going to be a 180-degree change to what we put through the rulemaking process.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, there's similar changes to before. I'll just skip to the next thing.
Is there any section you don't change the 2030, 2050 goals?
If we failed to do that, it was by accident. So, hopefully, Ms. Tchaikovsky will look carefully for that if the committee decides to make that change. So here we put in a specific deadline and an early deadline for the initial registration by the obligated entities. So the idea is on January 31st, 2024, each obligated entity would be required to submit their 2023 data to us. Now, the 2023 data is not what would be used to determine their obligation on starting January 1, 2026. But it would help us see a baseline on, okay, what are the what's the amount of gallons being sold in 2023? And quite frankly, it's also just to make sure everyone is registering with us, because that is a big concern we have with this bill is we don't have relationships with any of these entities that are going to be brought into our jurisdiction through this clean heat standard. The relationship we're going to have with them is very different from the relationship we have with the regulated utilities, where we have vast control over every aspect of their operations and their budgets. And here it's a much more limited interaction with us. These obligated entities need to register with us, and they need to meet their annual requirements under the Clean Heat Standard. And so that creates a concern that entities might not register with us. And so we have some other provisions we'll get to later in the bill to try to increase the chances we get full compliance with this new law. But one of the suggestions we make here is have an early deadline for registration so that we can start seeing who's out there and making sure we're tailoring the program to the correct amount of gallons of each type of heating fuel that's being sold out there. And so that's why we have that new deadline and an early one. And I should be clear when I'm talking about the new entities we're going to be regulating. Vermont Gas, we obviously currently do regulate, but it's the other entities that we don't currently regulate.
If we have time at the end, I'm going to double back and talk about obligated parties, who you're, how you're, I think I think other members of the committee would like to get greater clarity on who the obligated parties will be, and whether, for instance, it's the seller of a fuel, the first seller of a fuel, or it's the buyer of the fuel, that kind of thing. But we'll come back to that. Thank you.
Well, it's a good segue actually to our next comment. I think we'll get into that, Chair Bray, but let me know if we don't address it. So we've suggested in addition, I think the committee has already talked about this, of some sharing of information, that the Vermont Department of Taxes shall annually provide a list of entities that pay the fuel tax, and then we have the reference to the fuel tax. And the idea here is that they have that list, but there may be privacy concerns that prevent them from sharing it unless there's explicit direction from the legislature to share that information. But an important thing for the committee to be aware of is that this will give us a partial list of the obligated entities, because the tax department's list is looking at the entities that pay the fuel tax, and that's charged at the retail level. So as I read the definition of obligated parties in this bill, it's intentionally written to stay within Vermont's jurisdiction over these sales. And so it's capturing retailers who are coming from out of state. There, the first point of sale is the retail sale. So they would be on the tax department's list, provided they're complying with the current fuel tax. But for entities that are picking up within Vermont and then going out and delivering to people's homes, it's the wholesaler that has the obligation for the fuel that they import to their wholesale facility. And that's the group of entities that we don't know who they are, and I'm not sure anyone in the state does have a list of who those entities are. And so it may be that I think this information from the tax department, it won't solve the problem of who are these entities if some of them don't register, but it would at least let us know if there is a problem, because we could look at the tax department and see, okay, we've got 250 million gallons of fuel according to their records that were sold. And then we look at who's registered with us and how much they say they sold the previous year. And those numbers should equal each other. But if they don't, we'd have a moment where we know that early in the 2024 legislative session, and we might be coming to you to look for additional enforcement tools or some sort of change to make sure that we're capturing all of the entities that are out there, and that's a level playing field, and anyone who's not compliant doesn't get a competitive advantage over the entities that are complying.
Senator Watson.
So a couple of questions. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying about the obligated parties. So somebody who so to get fuel into Vermont, there's someone who sells it and there's somebody who buys it. So is the obligated party the buyer in Vermont? Or is the obligated party the seller who sold it into Vermont? Or
Right.
maybe that's not the right way to slice it.
Yeah, why don't I just go to the definition? And I believe,
Sorry, thank you.
yeah, I believe Laura Murphy from the Attorney General's office and Jeff Hand are both testifying tomorrow. And I anticipate they'll explain
Okay,
why it's defined this way and the history of that and the legal reasons that this is the definition that you're looking at.
yeah,
So the first 10A, that's capturing Vermont gas, or if there were another entity that started selling natural gas, they would be captured there. And then for other heating fuels, it's the entity that makes the first sale of heating fuel into the state for consumption within the state, as into or in the state. So that's your retail fuel dealer coming from out of state. The first sale is at that person's home in Norwich if the dealer came from Hanover. And then for the other sales, it's a wholesaler is making the first sale into or within the state when they sell it to a propane dealer who's going out for retail sales.
so in that case, it's the seller.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's how I read it, yeah.
And so thinking about the wholesalers, that's the group of folks that we don't necessarily have a list of. You all don't necessarily have any suggestions as to like how to create that list or how to generate a list of wholesalers like that? Or just hope they register?
We don't, yeah. I think what we suggest in here is front loading the registration requirement and having bigger penalties that are brought to bear if someone doesn't register. So we'll get to that later in our
Great.
suggestions.
Thank you,
Yeah.
sorry.
And sorry, a little aside, so Senator McCormick, the PDF version of this, the PUC was kind enough to do their highlights. We're seeing red up here, but the version that we got is in blue.
Thank you.
Thanks to the PUC for that.
Sure. So then this is a place in the bill where we have a lengthy comment about the default delivery agent, but we did not attempt to actually make red lines to this section because we have kind of a large suggested change for the committee's consideration. And then we know if the committee agrees in going in that direction, we're happy to work with legislative counsel on how to rework some of this section on the default delivery agent. And the change we're suggesting is instead of saying an obligated party may meet its annual requirement for a designated default agent appointed by the commission, that this would become an obligated party must meet its annual requirement through the default delivery agent unless the commission approves an alternative method of compliance. So this would make it truly the default that it's presumed you're making a payment to that default delivery agent and the default delivery agent is doing the clean heat measures. But if an entity wants to show that it's going to meet its obligation in another way, then they can come to us and we would look at that and we give them approval if we think it meets the statutory requirements and the goals. And so that would be similar to how currently everyone's in for the energy efficiency charge, but there's a provision that allows large businesses to do their own energy efficiency measures and get out of making that payment and show that they're meeting or exceeding what would have happened otherwise. That's the SMEET program. I will not remember what that acronym stands for. Tom does.
Self-managed energy efficiency program.
Yeah, so this is a significant change, but we do think this would increase the likelihood of success in implementing this program. As you said before, we do have real concerns about these new entities that we don't currently regulate, but we're going to be regulating. And the default delivery agent model is something we have a lot more comfort with. We have experience with that with Efficiency Vermont. We think that's been a very successful program, and we know how to regulate a single entity, look at their budget, look at how they're doing the clean heat measures, if it's the most cost-effective way to get the maximum amount of emissions. And that's more within the scope of what we currently do. And so we think that would be a significant improvement to make that a presumed model of compliance.
So, in part, I mean, it sounds like you're saying, you're more confident that you can manage the program if the default delivery agent is truly the default. I mean, the block of business goes through the DEA, individual entities that want to choose their own way of getting the required clean heat credits can opt out and they'll use their own program if they just need to meet or exceed the same program requirements.
Yes, and I'd say it also makes enforcement a lot easier. So when you have a list of options of here are all the ways you can comply with their clean heat requirements, and I understand why the bill gives all those options. There's benefit to giving multiple options to the entities to pick which one meets their business model best. But then if we have issues with compliance, and we go to an entity, there's just some room for them to say, well, no, I didn't make my payment to the default delivery agent because I was complying through using this other method. And we would then examine that, and there might be a proceeding or enforcement action on whether they actually were meeting that other requirement. But it's just a little less clear cut what they had to do. And if you make it truly default that they make the payment unless they get an alternative approved by us, then that's much easier to check. Did they make the payment? No. Have we approved an alternative? No. Okay, this is going to enforcement. We've added some.
Sorry, I'm
Yep.
thinking a little slower than you're telling. If you, so we'll work with council. I think what would be helpful is to see any new language that would make that suggested change so that we could work directly with Mr. Chowski and craft language. So if we want to change over, we'd see what that looks like in terms of language for the bill.
Yes, we're happy to do that.
Thank you.
This new language we've added at the bottom of this page and spilling over onto the next page is, as noted in the comment, this is taken directly from 30 VSA section 209, which addresses the appointment of an energy efficiency utility. So it's giving us flexibility to do an order of appointment rather than go through the state contracting process, and to have that order of appointment have a longer term than what state contracting generally allows. And so this is almost word for word from 30 VSA section 209, giving us that ability to designate the default delivery agent by order of appointment or by contract.
So just to make sure, 209 is the language you use for contracting with the energy efficiency utility.
Correct.
Yeah. We do have a suggestion here when it comes to ordering an obligated party that fails to retire the number of clean heat credits required. Right now, the bill says if the party does that, we may order them to make a non-compliance payment to the default delivery agent. We think that should be a shall. That avoids any argument and any might make for why we shouldn't require this payment. It should just be automatic. If you don't meet your obligations, you have to make a payment. So there are a few other places in our red lines where we suggest changing the shall to may because we would like more flexibility, but this is a place where we think it's better to clarify the legislature's intent here that you have to make that payment if you haven't met your obligation. And then we're getting into some more of the enforcement provisions. So number 4 here, that doesn't need to be said. That's presumed to be the case, but it doesn't hurt to say it explicitly that the additional enforcement authority we're being given here is in addition to other enforcement that's already available. And then I want to flag the comment I have on this new language in 5 that I have not run this by the Consumer Protection Division of the Attorney General's office, and so they would need to be consulted about whether this type of provision makes sense if it's worded correctly. But this added language, the intent here is to make clear if an entity fails to register with us, an obligated entity, that is a per se automatic violation of the Vermont Consumer Protection Act's prohibition on unfair and deceptive business practices. And the fact they might not have known they were required to register is not a defense. So this just kind of ups the ante for them to register with us and comply from the get-go.
Are there other places in any law that the PUC uses that has this sort of the per se violation approach? Or you're using this, just trying to understand if this is if it's unusual, or I get the point. It makes it very clear that it's a violation, that a violation failing to register is a violation.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering if it's unusual or not to define it that way in statute.
I believe that's done in some other instances when the legislature wants to make clear that a certain compliance measure is needed. Again, I'm not sure if this is the exact language. The Attorney General's office would have more insight on that. I will say, when it comes to how we do the limited amount of enforcement that we currently do, we have standard provisions if someone builds a new project and they get a certificate of public good. And when one of those provisions isn't met, it is usually quite straightforward. Like there is a deadline to commission to start a solar project, and they didn't meet that deadline, and then they connected a year later after the deadline that expired and their certificate of public good had expired. We do view those, we treat them basically as a clear automatic violation. We have to provide an opportunity for a hearing under the Administrative Procedure Act, but we regularly have entities waive that right and just pay the penalty that we've proposed in that matter, because there's not really an argument when you have clear facts of what happened. And again, this seems like a similar situation in that it's just saying 2 things happened. One, they sold fuel in Vermont the year before, and 2, they didn't register with us. And we wouldn't see a benefit to having a long argument and resolving an issue over whether that was a violation. And here it just makes clear it is. And so I think this would be a helpful provision and make compliance more likely to happen.
Well, and I know that's a major concern because you have new parties to deal with. So the other thing that seems helpful to me is that there are, I'm imagining the vast majority of businesses will operate, in compliance, and So it'd be, as you said earlier, unfair competitive advantage for some to fail to comply to the disadvantage of those who do. Have you sent this language to the AG's office?
I did send it over yesterday after we submitted it to the committee. And I flagged it for their environmental and consumer protection division to look at.
Great. We'll have Ms. Murphy sent this week, so we'll check in with her directly. But if you can keep running that down too, that would be great.
Yes. Recommended change to one of the dates for a report, a regular report. Or no, I'm sorry, this is a one-time report for after the year the rules are first adopted. And we think changing that to January 15th rather than August 31st would be helpful, although I'm now looking at it and wondering if we need to make clear the year in which that is. We'll take another look at this, but
What I see each year, I read that to be a standing obligation of PUC to report each year.
Yep.
And so a little explanation here, if this follows kind of the cycle of evaluation that is carried out for the energy efficiency utilities and for the distribution utilities under tier 3. Our goal is for the efficiency utilities is kind of to wrap up by August of each year. And so this paragraph requires the commission not only to wrap up the evaluation of what was accomplished in the previous year, but then kind of evaluate, did we provide, an equitable opportunity for everyone, and how can we improve in subsequent years? And so that just asking a bit more on top of the regular evaluation process. So I think if we wanted to have some meaningful recommendations each year, we would request a few more months to file those reports.
Well, and the timing's helpful on our side of the street in that it's the beginning of the legislative session. So if you have recommendations that require any kind of statutory change, we have an opportunity to do that work.
So I just want to make sure that I'm clear about that. So for a January 15th report, is that on the previous year or 2 years prior? Or is it fiscal years?
Yeah, that's what I was getting hung up on too.
So again, if this follows, the efficiency utility model, year closes on December 31, and then they would file what they achieved that previous calendar year, sometime in the spring. I want to say March 15, but don't quote me on that date. And then the Department of Public Service carries out its evaluation of their savings claim, and they get a proposal to the PUC in the June timeframe. If there's any disagreement, there's a period for the efficiency utility to comment, and then the commission would make its determination. So going back to your question, what we submit in January 15 would be for, 2 calendar years prior.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure I was clear. Thank you.
Not 24 full months, but
Right, yes,
about
yeah,
15 months approximately,
yes.
13 months.
So the list of eligible measures, we just have a note that we're reading. I mean, most of these, if not, or nearly all of them, are going to be eligible for significant amounts of federal funding through the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act. And we're reading this as allowing for that funding to contribute to these measures. We were, I'm not sure what number 7 was intended to do, and we recommend deleting that. So a heat pump or any other approved appliance is going to qualify as a clean heat credit. And the emissions reductions from a renewable energy system, on the other hand, if that's connected to the grid, that's accounted for in the electric sector, not in the thermal sector.
Oh, if I didn't mean to interrupt, I just wanted to flag that I do have a question about this
Yeah.
particular piece, which is, I understand, I've had some conversations outside of the room around this section, and I just want to posit to you where I still stand to see if it
Yeah.
makes sense, which is, I think that I'm concerned that if we take this section out, we will be making it more difficult for low and moderate income Vermonters to actually tie together those two systems. Typically, more higher income folks are able to afford to do the renewable energy projects and pair everything. So do you envision this change at all limiting the incentives that would be available for that combination? Or is this just merely going to make it so that it's properly accounted for? I don't know if you've contemplated that at all.
In my mind, this is about accounting. Renewable energy credits are accounted for under the renewable energy standard, and clean heat measures are accounted for under this program.
And there's a real concern that if this measure stays in here, how we regulate net metering, which is the bulk of the renewable energy systems going in now in Vermont. For a net metering solar system, we have extensive rules. We have a biannual update every 2 years where parties come to us, bring lots of data, including looking at issues like adoption by low and moderate income Vermonters. We evaluate that, we make changes to that program and to properly incentivize those systems in accordance with the state energy policy and the legislature's direction on how net metering should happen. Having an additional incentive with the clean heat program would be very messy, and I honestly don't know how we would reconcile those two. And so we share your goal of wanting low and moderate income Vermonters to have access to these renewable electricity systems, and that is a concern right now, that the studies have shown the uptake tends to be higher income Vermonters. But we don't think having that designated as a clean heat measure would make sense here. And part of it too is just, again, the accounting, that the emissions reductions happening from that renewable electricity system, if it's grid connected, are accounted for in the electric sector. And so I think we'd also risk the double counting issue if it were accounted for here.
Thank you.
So the heat pumps or electric appliances referred to in there are allowed counted in and of themselves.
Yes.
It's just everything to that source. On-site increased scale renewable energy systems that are supplying those lines.
Yes, and I will say this program is going to create an additional incentive to get net metering systems, because as people move towards more electrification and their electric bills get higher, net metering program may be more enticing to them.
And I guess that's kind of my concern, is that if we're calling it out as an eligible measure, the people who would get an additional bite at that apple would be folks who kind of understand that investment and can invest in it with the upfront cost. So, but what I'm hearing from you is you don't believe that this would change or take away from a possible additional incentive in the thermal sector, but it would be rectified with meeting electric goals on the renewable energy standard side.
Yeah, and actually the way you phrase that makes me think, if we were doing the rulemaking and this provision were in there, I don't know it actually would create any more incentive, because we might account for it and say, well, the renewable energy system that's going in there gets 0 credit because that's already been accounted for in the electric sector. And so when we look at the clean heat measure, we'd be focused on the heat pump and the other things that are already counted as measures. Our next position, again, some of these are just kind of more ministerial changes. We do have a suggestion that we make clear that the obligation to that can be given to the default delivery agent, that can be transferred in whole or in part, or actually, sorry, that's a different provision. This is saying if there's federal or state policies that provide funding in whole or in part for these systems, that's okay. We're not saying you have to pay money and to get credit. We're saying you have to show the emissions reductions. So I think spelling that out clearly, particularly now, we're in a different place than we were a year from now because we've got a lot of federal money that is going to apply to these measures. We do suggest an added sentence to address the potential double counting issue of making clear that clean heat credit shall only be eligible to be counted toward one state policy or program. And Tom can explain this a little better.
Sure. So as it's currently written, a tier 3 measure or a unit of thermal savings that Efficiency Vermont or Burlington Electric produce, I think it's proper for them to be eligible to count towards the clean heat standard because we have one goal as a state, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the thermal sector. And so those actions that Efficiency Vermont or Burlington Electric or Green Mountain Power for tier 3 or any of the distribution utilities, those are all assisting in meeting those goals. What I think would not be ideal is if Green Mountain Power, claims that tier 3 credit for installing a heat pump at someone's house, but then that also was claimed by an obligated party. So there are a couple of ways to deal with that, and I think the simplest solution is to say, all right, let's say our goal for a year is to achieve 100 units of savings through clean heat measures. We should recognize that Efficiency Vermont and the DUs are all contributing toward that goal. And so what we'd say is, all right, they achieved 5 units of savings. So now what the obligated parties have to do is they have to achieve 95. So that just does away with any potential for double counting or trading, selling, etc.
So we talked about this issue last year, so I'm not surprised we're talking about it again this year. We had talked about, I think Senator McDowell were here, he was saying something like we can't sell the same course twice. And then the last time we talked about it, it's like, well, there are 2 different courses actually. There's a tier 3 obligation. Someone's meeting that, applying the monies expended in that program to meeting that obligation. The fact that in another program that there's the reductions, the greenhouse gas reductions, there also satisfy the goals of the clean heat, of the Affordable Heat Act, that you could earn credits there as well. And so I have one side on each side of the fence, uncomfortable position to be in. So I'd like to think about it aloud with you just a little bit. If you're a utility, you have to spend your own money to meet the tier 3 obligation, right? So you're investing to do that. But then there's not sort of a return on that investment in terms of you're just meeting an obligation. There's no sort of credit earned for it. You're just so if you see that obligation, which the utility spends money on to fulfill, does it make sense that you say, well, that same action actually could earn you credit in a program that recognizes that effort? And that's the thing I'm trying to puzzle out a little bit aloud with you. I don't know the answer to that.
A system certainly could be created to enable that sort of transaction. And that's a policy choice for this body to make.
Yeah, I guess I would again, thinking out loud, the concern that comes to mind to me is, I think if that were the system, then the distribution utilities would have a significant competitive advantage over other entities in these clean heat measures. So remember, we're creating a tradable credit. And so if the utility already has a legal obligation to do this as part of its tier 3 requirements without getting a single penny on top of that for those also being clean heat measures, then they could sell the clean heat measures on the market for a penny and be better off than they were beforehand. And that could mess with the price of the market because no one else can sell these measures that cheaply. And so I think it's generally a good policy decision to not allow double counting.
Alright, so I guess this is I can flag my copy and say, keep thinking about this one. Alright. Anyone else want to chip in on this before we move on?
I just want to say, it does create a complication for the PUC in determining what's the reduction that we require each year for the obligated entities. Do we account for what the distribution utilities and efficiency utilities are expected to achieve? And then there's also the variable that tier 3 enables the distribution utility to meet its RES obligation, either through energy transformation projects, or it could say, you know what, I'm going to retire additional tier 2 credits, in which case it's producing 0 greenhouse gas emissions under tier 3.
Right, great. Sarah Lawson?
This is raising a question for me that I have about the creation of credits, like what births a credit. And I feel like that might be later in the bill, so I don't know if that's the question I should hold off on.
Yeah, I don't think there's much explanation in the bill. I see that as something we would be figuring out in the rulemaking. It is going to be a challenge for us because we don't currently do that. And so this would be an entirely new concept for us of creating a market for tradable credits.
I think that was really my question, which you might have just answered, which is like, do you feel comfortable creating the framework of what actually, because I think if like somebody puts in a heat pump, who gets that? Obviously should create a credit, but like, I mean, unless it's with tier 3 potentially, but is that credit birthed with the installer or the seller or both, or does that question make sense? Like, and so I sort of feel like right now that'd be up to the PUC to sort it out.
I think Rich Cowart was in here maybe 2 weeks ago, and this question came up, and his explanation, which I tend to agree with, is so an installer goes out and installs a heat pump at someone's house. At that point, the homeowner owns the credit, but then there's a contractual agreement. I'm going to give you an incentive, and in return, you give me the ability to claim this clean heat credit.
The incentive is the break on the price.
Correct.
I think it's how rebates from Efficient Vermont flow through. It's the price of the cold mounted heat pump, for instance, gets reduced by the amount of the incentive.
Okay.
So in essence, the customer got the value of it, but received it in the form of a lower price for the cold mounted heat pump purchase. But you used to work with it.
Yeah.
So.
No, thank you, Chairman Bray. My only other, and maybe this analogy is helpful, maybe it's not, and I don't fully understand, which is if you create a rec as a net metering customer, you can choose to retire that rec as yourself, but then you won't get the net metering rate discount on your electric bill. So you could, as an individual, choose to participate in the market yourself, or, there's a program, I think out of Middlebury or something, that collects a bunch of individuals to do that. But you as an individual then lose the net metering incentive that the utility would provide to you. So I think about it kind of like that.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah, so there is a way that you, I guess, as an individual could game the system if you don't want your person to get the credit for it. So then they have to install an additional heat pump to meet the carbon emission standards. But I don't see a lot of Vermonters doing that in the same way. We don't see a lot of Vermonters doing that now with renewable energy credits, unless they're a large, I could see an industrial customer potentially. But yeah, can I ask a different question?
Sure.
Okay. So I just want to understand a little bit back to your question, because I'm also thinking a little slower this morning around kind of the double counting piece. My end goal with this bill is that we are incentivizing measures as quickly as possible for the most vulnerable Vermonters to meet our greenhouse gas emission goals. And what concerns me is I think that the addition of the language that you're suggesting could make that more difficult, because we do have programs that, I mean, it does meet both goals if you install a heat pump. And I don't necessarily think that that is double counting as you described. I do think it's two different ways for us to meet our goals, whether it be greenhouse gas emissions goals as defined in the GWSA or other. So I guess my question to you would be, do you have any concerns that this would cause fewer projects to happen with this change?
I don't see that happening. I continue to believe that all eligible measures, regardless of whether it's delivered by a TU program, an efficiency utility program, or an obligated party, they should all reduce what we're trying, they should all count towards what we're trying to achieve as a state, which is our overall greenhouse gas goals, as well as serving, all populations. So I think the change that, the way I envision this working is what I described before. As a state, we want to reach 100 units per year. I'm just making that number up for discussion purposes. We are counting what the efficiency utilities and the distribution utilities are doing towards that goal. And so let's say they achieve 5 units of savings, then what the obligated entities need to do is achieve the remaining 95.
And in a previous change you recommended to this bill, who is on the hook in that situation for enforcement purposes? Like is it the designated default agent, or is it the fuel dealer themselves who might be seeking out a designated agent? What happens if those aren't met based on the previous change you recommended? Like if we had to go through the process and we aren't meeting our requirements then?
Right. So as the bill stands today, it would be on the fuel dealers.
Yeah.
What we recommended, we might want to work on some new language that would centralize that with the default delivery agents.
Okay.
In which case they would be regulated similar to an efficiency utility where they have annual goals. And if they're not performing, then, we have some type of proceeding to either get them to comply or we seek someone else to do that job.
So in this hypothetical, and I apologize if this is, okay. In this hypothetical, an EEU, let's say, is both now obligated in a new way where they're contractually, the enforcement is on them, and they're unable to now count it towards other goals that they have. So I feel like we might be disadvantaging some of our best performing programs in a way that is concerning.
I don't see it that way. The efficiency utility would retain its existing funding streams, would have all the same goals that are assigned to those funding streams. And to the extent that they achieve greenhouse gas reductions in the thermal sector through those funding streams and programs, those would reduce what is needed to be achieved through the clean heat program. Presumably, they would have a new funding stream
Yes,
for clean heat measures and new goals
okay,
and new programs.
okay,
Yeah, and it's also part of why we're really looking at making sure these are separate and that you don't have the mix is because you do want as big an incentive as possible, but you also need to make sure you don't create a market failure, and especially when you're starting a market that doesn't currently exist. And so we were looking at this with an eye towards where would a subset of entities, in this case, whether it's distribution utilities or energy efficiency utilities, have a competitive advantage over the other entities. Because if you have that rather than a level playing field, you don't get the new businesses coming up and participating in the market, and we could actually end up with many fewer measures than what you get if you create a market where no one has an advantage over another entity.
okay, thank you. It's very interesting.
Right. The last sort of flavor of that question is, think about if a DU brings tier 3 money to the table,
Yes.
incentivize tier 3 action, and another party brings money to the table to support, you end up with layered incentives.
Yeah,
And we might end up, so there could be a synergistic effect where we see actually more work happen, but now you might end up with a portion to credit, or you might say, no, these are entirely different things you're counting. You're counting making your tier 3 obligation, and the other folks are counting their credit obligation. But what makes it a little murky for me all over again is that the unit of measurement is greenhouse gas reductions. So they're aiming for the same thing. It's a little tricky to figure out, but they well might later. So I'm back in noodling this one over some more.
And I think the layering, I don't envision as a problem because if there's an Efficiency Vermont rebate out there, that's available to all Vermonters regardless of who puts the heat pump in. So yes, it gets layered, but it's available on a level playing field.
Layering happens today all the time, where Efficiency Vermont and a distribution utility will both promote a measure and they will share the savings, presumably in a proportional way to what they're contributing to that measure. The distribution utility gets to claim a certain amount of savings towards its tier 3 obligation, and the efficiency utility gets to claim some savings as well.
We went through a very similar puzzle to solve several years ago on for the tier 3 obligation, when just the two entities you were naming, Efficiency Vermont and the DU, they both had performance obligations, and they were both making a transaction happen. And then there was a question about, well, who gets credit for having met their goals. Is that pretty well settled now? And how did that get settled?
Well, a lot of it happened behind closed doors and not in front of the PUC. I think, they just, I would ask them.
Doing a couple more things. We did just have a note on the equity advisory group. And we just want to make sure the committee is aware we take diversity, equity, and inclusion seriously. And this is going to be front and center in our work on this program if the legislature passes this. And we do welcome this equity advisory group and working with them. We think that could be helpful, but we aren't sure if it's meant to be time limited or if it's a group that's going to just exist in perpetuity. And so we just flagged that as something where some more clarity would be helpful. And we would like as much flexibility as possible in terms of, we expect there would be a number of meetings with that group early on in the process as the rulemaking is happening. But then the meetings might not be needed as frequently as the program gets rolling.
So we also, this bill, or its predecessor, was born at the same time that the environmental justice bill was being developed last spring. So I think the motivations were very similar. And the question I've had since is, okay, we did pass the Environmental Justice Act. There is an equity advisory council created, and to what degree being duplicative. However, that practically speaking, that advisory group's not been stood up yet, and it's not operating yet. So I'm feeling drawn to keeping this one because it will be something that you can surely manage as opposed to relying on another equity council managed through another agency. Does that sound, I mean, I'm just wondering if you'd say, oh, we would rather tie in to another council, or we'd rather sort of run our own program because we know how we would do it. We're already working on this very topic, the DEI approach.
So that's not something we've talked with the commissioners about of what their preferred approach should be. So we can't represent a position of the PUC. My initial just personal reaction is that there could be a benefit to having our own group that the commission would have more control over how often the meetings happened and how those interactions went. But I would be a little worried about what we don't want is then the other group that's been set up by the environmental justice bill comes in and they have different ideas of how to increase the equity issues. And then we might be in a bind of one advisory group's telling us one thing, another's telling us another. And so it might be some more clarity on what that group is doing, how long it's going to be in existence would be helpful.
Thank you, Chair Bray. So one comment we've had in another committee I serve on GovOps was from Susanna Davis, Director Davis, and she made the point that there's a lot of working groups and a lot of things that she is being asked to serve on and her department is being asked to serve on, and she didn't feel that duplicative DEI groups are necessarily a benefit if they don't have a decision-making or like real teeth to the work that they're doing. If it's just kind of out there to make us all check a box, that's pretty worthless. And I respect that opinion. And of course, maybe it's worthwhile for us to have her department have a specific comment on this. But it does feel like this equity advisory group does have decision making. It does have teeth in a way that they are advising the TAG group. So I feel comfortable with how it's framed here. But perhaps we could ask her to comment on, we don't want to create a duplicative thing and have any kind of tension between a group that they're already seated on. Mm-hmm. And I'm still uncomfortable with the idea of TAG having like a lay person on it as an organization. But my comfortability only comes from the fact that we have the equity advisory group overlaying with it. So there's a couple of decision points there if we were to change it.
Well, the other thing, practically speaking, I'm imagining is that here's equity, the council, which would address something from A to Z, like a lot of different things could come through. This seems like a relatively specialized area of not, I mean, there'll be, I would think, a fair amount of education going on with the group working with the PUC in terms of coming up to speed on what like all the technical options are and stuff like that. That the group will learn and evolve together. And I think of it as being the same DEI frame of mind, but a specialized subset of knowledge that they would have to master in order to really play an effective role. And that's what also makes me find like have your own. So we'll
Yeah,
see if we can mistake this.
or even just a comment on
Or,
it.
yeah. Thank you.
Before we move on, I forget, did we address the question of how are the per diems funded?
We haven't, that is a question we had. It wasn't clear to us.
How, I'm sorry, I missed the question. How is the,
The per diem for different members.
So I think the technical advisory group as well as the equity advisory group, for those members that are not otherwise compensated by their employers, have a per diem.
Yep.
Which seems like a very reasonable approach. It's just not clear how those per diems will be funded.
okay, I don't, thank you. I don't think they're called out specifically in the appropriation section.
Yeah, it's one of those things that larger agencies, it probably doesn't matter, but we're a 25-person agency. Our entire budget is around $4 million. And so I don't see this being a significant amount, but it still would be helpful to us to have clarity about where that money comes from. On the consumer protection provisions, I believe you heard from Mr. Porter from the Department of Public Service that they weren't sure this made sense for them to be doing this rulemaking. And so we were just flagging also that we see that as it's probably the Attorney General's office going to Superior Court for those types of consumer protection matters. And they may already have that authority. I believe they do, but that would be something to talk with them about. Okay, so then on the reports, we would ask that the committee eliminate the requirement of a October 1, 2024 report. Remember on January 15th, 2025, we're going to be submitting the rules. So that's just 3.5 months later. And so we're just concerned that doing this report on October 1st, 2024 would take away our time and resources when we're in the thick of finalizing the rules that get proposed. And then when we get to the facilitator and the public engagement process, just really big picture, we want to convey public engagement is really inherent in our process. And particularly in recent years, this has been front and center in what we do. And so we have a lot of experience in that. We intend to do that in this process. We have a robust, inclusive public engagement. And we think we'll be more successful in that if we're just given the general direction from the legislature to go forth and do that, as opposed to the current language in here, which I believe came from the House towards the end of the session last year without testimony from us on it. It gets very prescriptive, and this version is less prescriptive than what came out last year, but we still think it has a lot of very specific meetings with specific groups of people, and we don't want to be in the position of a regular Vermonter worried about their propane bill comes to a meeting and we say, I'm sorry, the focus of this meeting is the fuel dealer's perspective. Our way of engaging with the public is we have multiple rounds of comments, we have multiple workshops, we invite everyone, we hear from everyone who shows up. And so we think that's actually more inclusive than the prescriptive requirements that are laid out here. And so that's why you'll see a lot of strikeouts that we recommend in this section. So I want to be clear, we're not saying we should strike this out so we don't have to engage with the public. We're saying we will engage with the public. We have a lot of experience doing this, and but we think it'll work better to have a more robust, nimble, inclusive process that we already think we do well, rather than this prescriptive process.
And I also feel like this one's a little on me terms of like the drafting from over the summer, fall, for, for not realizing quite, if we had moved, the House's strategy was to do it through order. And we switched to rule to gain the sort of robust process that you're describing. It would have made sense at that point to rely on the robust process that we're prescribing rulemaking and have eliminated the prescriptive language that was actually intended, I think, by the House to be appended to order making, because order making didn't entail all that. So to me, it feels like I should have used all this stuff. So I'm weighing in on your behalf. It's not about striking for releasing meetings. It's about shifting how we ensure that they happen. So thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the only thing I'll add to that is, even when the bill was written as by rule or order, we had every intention of having a robust public engagement process, even if we were doing it by order. And actually, the process we currently do when we're doing a rulemaking, the robust, inclusive process with stakeholders happens over the course of months to sometimes multiple years before we do step one of the formal rulemaking process. So we do all that by choice as part of the commission's mission to serve the public interest, that we want to hear from everyone who has an interest. There are a couple of just kind of minor changes we suggest just to kind of bring this up to speed with our electronic case management system. I think some of this was drafted with the idea in mind of the traditional clipboard and paper of your name and email address on this. And we would allow, I mean, if anyone contacts our clerk's office by phone, by email, or even a written letter and says, I want to follow this case or this proceeding, our clerk's office adds them to the list of notification. Okay. And some of this is to just, I put my lawyer hat on. If I envision where someone who's unhappy with the final outcome might raise a challenge, and the current language about, this is before we get to the formal Administrative Procedure Act rulemaking. Right now, there's a requirement in here that we incorporate necessary changes in response to public comments. And I think it would be better to leave it more general, that we consider those changes in our response to the public comments. Because what we see as necessary might be different from what someone else sees as necessary.
Yeah, so you, in essence, is this a subjective term and you want to eliminate subjectivity?
Yes, I think probably most of the public commenters, in their mind, every comment they submit is necessary. But when we have two comments that are completely in polar opposites, asking us to do what to do, that just creates a tricky situation. And we get that all the time, and we have a good process for reconciling those things. It's just, again, having more flexibility would be helpful.
So this is outside of the formal rulemaking process, but if you think about what's inside the formal rulemaking process, is you put out a draft rule, it's out for comment, and you have to address why you did or didn't adopt someone's comments. And so that's kind of the weighing that the PUC already does. And, you know, I envision that this change that Kyle just mentioned as being similar.
Yeah. We would ask that you take away the deadline about contracting with a consultant to assist in implementation of clean heat credits. We are going to make every effort right off the bat if we get this handed to us. In fact, we'll probably start working on that contract even before the bill is passed, just in anticipation of it headed our way, because we would like that and we need that assistance. But when you have a hard deadline in there and the shell, it raises a concern if the contracting process doesn't go as planned. And we have had other requests for proposals go out and no one responds. And this is a new program. and we hope we'll get a lot of interest in it, but we don't know. So that just gives more flexibility.
I think from every department and agency that comes in, they've expressed at one time or another difficulties with filling all the positions that they have.
Yes, and that gets to the comment on the next page that the bill currently has us coming back a year from now and reporting on a suggested permanent revenue stream. Our preference would be that get decided now. We don't really see any information that we'll have a year from now that we don't have now. We put in this comment. At the end of the day, when we kick it around at the commission, the sources of long-term funding that occur to us would be an increase in the fuel tax, a charge on the obligated entities, or the general funds. And we did want to flag that historically, the commission's entire budget has come from the entities that we regulate, not from the general fund. So we would see a benefit to clarifying what the funding stream is, and that also provides reassurance that the money is going to be there year after year, because the current version just gives us 1 year of funding, and that helps us fill the new positions.
So this is, there's no strike, there's no ad, it's just flagging for us that we should be attentive to the notion of long-term sustainable funding.
Yes.
Right, and if in this tight labor market, we want to get the talented individuals that we need to work on this program, I think they would be more likely to sign up and accept a job offer if they knew that that job would be funded for more than 1 year.
Well, I've already talked with the 2 money chairs about, that this bill's coming their way. Let's start thinking ahead of time on how we can achieve just that. So,
Just on that, is it typical to have in the bill where the funding would come from?
well, to launch the program, we have an appropriation section.
So we would identify the funding source in the appropriation section.
Yes, and so there, amongst the options, you could create a revenue stream to, I pointed out, you could create a revenue stream in the bill from the outset. You could stand the program up with a straight up appropriation. I think what would be of concern to me is if we use one-time money to to appropriate. And if it were a general fund, if we said, well, actually, we're supporting the program and we're going to affirm that through a base budget general fund contribution, then that provides some surety as opposed to one-time money, which who knows if we're going to show up in year 2 to fund the program. So
we should identify that in this bill.
right, by the time we see it on the floor, I like that we would have sorted that out.
Thank you. Right, so just so I understand, not necessarily a decision for us, might be a decision in a committee that holds more of the purse strings.
Yes, we end up, our actual mileage may vary when we go down the hall on what comes out from either finance or books or a combination of the two. So
Good thing we got 2 folks on some good committees.
we have a running start. That's right.
Just checking, so now we're at 13:10. I think we've covered all the points now. Yeah.
And we skipped over the economic modeling.
Yeah. So this is the last one. Tom, you want to speak to that?
Sure, just, we're asked in one or more of our reports, as well as part of the rulemaking process, to quantify the economic impact of adopting the Clean Heat Standard. And so historically, for example, in the Act 62 report of several years ago, the Department of Public Service and the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, who has access to economic modeling software, they assisted the commission in looking at the impacts of various options when we were thinking about Act 62. And so I think that would be very helpful to the commission as it works on the Clean Heat Standard and reporting back to the legislature to have access to those assets and resources.
So is that with Ken Jones and others?
Mr. Jones,
Just retired.
Did he retire?
I couldn't say, but yeah, Mr. Jones was helpful in the X2 process.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think, I can just make sure, I think our version does include. uh, Yeah, so we have an appropriation section and you have run that, is that correct?
No,
I'm sorry. here it
yeah,
is. I missed it when I was flipping the pages.
and I should reiterate, sometimes when people come and comment on the bills, they just focus on the changes that we want. They want not what we want to make sure stays in there, but I should reiterate, we do appreciate that if we're being given this program, there are the 3 new positions being added and the $800,000 number going to the Public Utility Commission does strike us as the right number for funding those 3 positions as well as the consultants that will be needed through this process.
It's 10 o'clock on the dot, paste your walkthrough perfectly. Any other committee questions, comments, or anything that we didn't come up yet that you feel like while you're still in the room with us, you want to share with us?
Nothing for me. Thank you.
Okay, so process-wise, Ms. Chakowski has these edits, and let me check with it. So I think what we're going to we'll go through a markup process, probably starting next Wednesday. I think we'll have finished all our testimony. We'll probably invite people in to fine tune things after that during markup, but I think we'll markup phase next Wednesday, and we'll start incorporating suggestions. We'll consider it for incorporation all the PUC requests as well as suggestions from other parties. So we'll cast the net, bring them all together, sit down with council, work through them as a committee with council, and make edits. So I guess that's a note to anyone who's in the room or watching, that if you have suggestions on the language in the bill, as we're moving towards the end of the testimony phase, please consider writing to the committee and offering suggested changes to the language, and that will be helpful for the committee in terms of any kind of consideration for further edits. And with that, Senator Washington?
So I just want to revisit one thing here. So I'm hearing you about the DDA. Other than that, but that's a big other than that, so you all are comfortable creating this program? Or are there are there other like legislative policy decision-making items that would be useful to spell out?
I think Kyle has incorporated in here a few ways to ensure, to try to ensure that we catch the obligated entities and make sure that they are registering with the PUC. So I think that's a very important one.
I think, as we noted in here, we have a lot of concerns about doing something new that hasn't been done before. But at the end of the day, we do what the legislature directs us to do, and we'll do our best with it. And if we're given this, we think with these changes, it would increase the chances that it's successful at the end of the day. But this is a new thing that we would be doing.
Okay, thank you.
It seemed like the orders, putting the orders tool in your toolkit would also be part of helping assure that success and be tuning things as part of the program. My understanding of the history of the efficiency or the energy efficiency utility program is that it was launched, and then it was a live and learn program, still is. There were changes made continually and in order to improve it. I'm guessing that, the way your suggestion around order making for tuning the operations of the program seemed part and parcel of that same spirit of we're standing up something new. Best on at this point, not knowing all the details, and we're gonna figure out many more details before we could launch, and then we will learn more by actually operating the program. I think for me, so I'll just say, it's an opinion. Sometimes people worry that you have to have figured everything out before you begin, and there's a wise prudence that we're figuring out enough to take the next step well, and very aware that we need to be sensitive to how the program's working, then have a mechanism to ensure that we can respond in a timely way to what we're learning to make improvements along the way. So, thanks very much. Anything else? Right. So we will take a committee break till 10:30, and then do our work this morning. Joyce Manchester from the Joint Fiscal Office will be coming in to talk to us more about IRA funding and how it will, one, to give us a general understanding because it has relevance beyond just S5, and two, to just make sure that we're aware of what is available, as best we understand it, in case we want to need any further adjustments to S5 to maximize our opportunity to pull down those funds